The cards fell like autumn leaves, each one sealing another nail in the coffin of hope. Rebecca Morrison watched her father's trembling hands reach for the whiskey bottle again, his eyes hollow with the kind of desperation that came from losing everything that mattered. The saloon reeked of smoke, sweat, and broken dreams, but it was the smell of fear that made her stomach turn. Fear that radiated from every pore of the man who'd once been her hero. Another hand, Morrison. The voice belonged to Snake Williams, a professional gambler whose smile was as sharp as the blade he kept hidden in his boot. Maybe your luck will turn. Her father's laugh was bitter as winter wind. What luck? I've already lost the farm, the cattle, even Mother's wedding ring. His voice cracked on the last words, and Rebecca felt her heart break a little more. I got nothing left to bet with. Snake's eyes glittered with the predatory gleam of a man who smelled blood in the water. Oh, but you do, Morrison. You got something very valuable indeed. His gaze shifted to Rebecca, standing frozen in the doorway, and she felt ice form in her veins. That pretty daughter of yours has got to be worth something. The saloon fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall, each second stretching like an eternity. Rebecca's father looked up at her with eyes full of shame and regret, but she could see the terrible calculation happening behind them. He was already so deep in debt that the bank would foreclose within the week. Snake Williams owned markers on everything they had left, and his patience was wearing thin. No, Rebecca whispered, but the words seemed to die in the thick air. Papa, no. One last game, Snake suggested, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Double or nothing. If you win, I tear up all your markers. Your farm stays yours, your daughter stays yours, and you walk away clean. He paused, letting the impossible hope settle. But if you lose... If I lose... Her father's voice was barely audible. If you lose, the girl comes with me. Payment in full for everything you owe. Snake's smile widened, showing teeth like a wolf. What do you say, Morrison? One hand of poker for everything? Rebecca wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to grab her father by the shoulders and shake sense into him. But she knew that look in his eyes, the look of a drowning man reaching for any rope, no matter how frayed. He was going to play. He was going to bet her life on 5 cards and a prayer. The game lasted 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. Rebecca watched every card fall, every bet placed, every chance at salvation slip through her father's fingers like sand. When Snake laid down his royal flush, the silence in the saloon was deafening. Her father stared at his pair of sevens as if willing them to transform into something better. But cards didn't lie, and neither did debts. Well now, Snake said, rising from his chair with predatory grace. Looks like I've got myself a new acquisition. Don't worry, Morrison. I'll take real good care of your daughter. That's when the saloon doors swung open with a bang that made everyone jump. The man who walked in was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never backed down from a fight. His clothes were expensive but practical, a rancher with money, respect, and the kind of presence that made even dangerous men like Snake Williams pause. Jackson Kane. Rebecca had heard the name whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration throughout the territory. He owned the largest ranch for 50 miles in any direction, controlled half the water rights in the county, and had a reputation for getting what he wanted by any means necessary. What he wanted in this grimy saloon was anyone's guess. His gray eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the calculating assessment of a man who missed nothing. When his gaze landed on Rebecca, something flickered in his expression, interest perhaps, or recognition of an opportunity. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and power. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Snake's confidence wavered slightly. Even a professional gambler knew better than to cross Jackson Kane without good reason. Nothing that concerns you, Kane. Just collecting on a debt. Jackson's smile was cold as winter steel. Everything in this county concerns me, Williams, especially when it involves taking a woman against her will. He stepped forward, and Rebecca noticed the way his hand rested casually near his gun. I have a proposition. The air in the saloon grew thick with tension. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized She was about to become the subject of negotiations between two powerful men, neither of whom cared what she wanted. "Morrison," Jackson said, not taking his eyes off Snake, "how much do you owe?" Her father's voice was barely a whisper. $5,000. Jackson reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. He counted out the money with deliberate precision, each bill falling onto the poker table like a judgment. $5,000, debt paid in full. Snake's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch, Kane?" Jackson's smile was sharp as a blade. "No catch for you, Williams. You get your money, Morrison's debt is clear, and you walk away." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But the girl comes with me." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She'd thought Snake Williams was the worst fate that could befall her, but Jackson Kane was something else entirely. A man who took what he wanted and made it his own, permanently. "You can't do this." Rebecca found her voice at last, stepping forward despite the trembling in her legs. "I'm not property to be bought and sold." Jackson turned to her, and for a moment she saw something almost like sympathy in his eyes. Almost. "No, Miss Morrison, you're not property. You're going to be my wife." The saloon erupted in murmurs and gasps, but Rebecca heard nothing except the roaring in her ears. Marriage, not slavery, not temporary ownership, but marriage, permanent, legal, binding. "The choice is yours," Jackson continued, his voice gentler now, but no less implacable. "Marry me and your father's debt disappears. Your family keeps their farm, their dignity, their future. Refuse and you go with Williams to God knows what fate." He gestured toward the money on the table. "I'll give you 30 seconds to decide." Rebecca looked at her father, slumped in his chair like a broken man. She looked at Snake Williams, whose eyes promised nothing but degradation and pain. And she looked at Jackson Kane, who stood waiting with the patience of a man who already knew her answer. She had no choice at all. "Yes," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jackson nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing else. "Then it's settled. Williams, take your money and get out of my sight. Morrison, your debt is paid and your farm is safe." He turned to Rebecca, and his voice dropped to a tone only she could hear. "We'll be married tomorrow morning. I suggest you use the time to say your goodbyes." As Jackson Kane walked out of the saloon with the casual confidence of a man who'd just acquired exactly what he wanted, Rebecca stood frozen between her old life and her uncertain future. Tomorrow she would become the wife of the most powerful man in the territory. Tonight, she would mourn the death of every choice she'd never get to make. Outside, thunder rumbled across the prairie sky, and Rebecca wondered if it was an omen or a warning. By morning, she would belong to Jackson Kane, and there would be no going back from whatever that meant. Dawn broke gray and merciless over the Morrison farm, painting the sky in shades that matched Rebecca's mood. She stood at her bedroom window, still wearing yesterday's dress, watching the sun rise on what would be her last morning as a free woman. In 3 hours, she would become Mrs. Jackson Kane, and the thought sat in her stomach like a stone. Her mother bustled around the small room, trying to make a wedding dress from the only white fabric they owned, an old tablecloth that had seen better days. Sarah Morrison's hands shook as she sewed. Whether from nerves or the early morning whiskey she thought Rebecca didn't know about, it was hard to say. "It'll be beautiful, dear," her mother murmured through a mouthful of pins. "Jackson Kane is a good man, even if his methods are unconventional. He could have let Snake Williams take you, but he didn't. That says something about his character." Rebecca wanted to laugh at the irony. Her mother was trying to find silver linings in a storm cloud, but Rebecca knew better. Jackson Kane hadn't saved her out of the goodness of his heart. He'd seen an opportunity and taken it, the same way he'd acquired every acre of his vast ranch. She was simply his latest acquisition. "Mama," Rebecca said quietly, "what if I can't do this? What if I can't be the kind of wife a man like that expects?" Her mother's hand stilled on the fabric. "Oh, sweetheart, you're stronger than you know. You've been running this household since you were 15, managing the farm accounts, handling the difficult customers at market. You know how to stand up to men when they try to push you around." She looked up, her eyes fierce with maternal protection. Jackson Kane may own half the territory, but he doesn't own your spirit. Don't let him. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation, followed by her father's voice calling up the stairs. Rebecca, Kane's here. Says he wants to talk to you before the ceremony. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd expected Jackson to simply show up at the appointed time, collect his bride, and get on with the business of marriage. The fact that he wanted to talk suggested either consideration for her feelings or a desire to lay down ground rules. Given what she knew of his reputation, she suspected the latter. She found him in the parlor, looking impossibly large in the small room filled with her family's modest furniture. He dressed for the occasion in a black suit that probably cost more than her father made in a year, but he wore it with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. When he saw her, he stood politely, his gray eyes assessing her with the same attention he might give to prime breeding stock. Miss Morrison, he said formally, I thought we should discuss the arrangements. Arrangements? Rebecca's voice came out steadier than she felt. I thought the arrangement was simple. I marry you, my father's debt disappears, and I become your property. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or approval of her directness. You're not property, Rebecca. May I call you Rebecca? When she nodded, he continued. You're going to be my wife, which means you'll have certain privileges and responsibilities. I want to make sure we understand each other. He gestured for her to sit, then took the chair across from her. The formality of the moment struck her as absurd. Here they were, discussing the terms of a forced marriage as if they were negotiating a business contract, which she supposed they were. First, Jackson said, you'll live at my ranch. It's a large house with a full staff, so you won't want for comfort. You'll have your own rooms if you prefer privacy, though eventually I'll expect us to share a bed. The clinical way he said it made Rebecca's cheeks burn, but he continued without acknowledging her embarrassment. You'll be introduced as my wife to business associates and neighbors. I expect you to behave appropriately at social functions. And what exactly constitutes appropriate behavior? Rebecca asked, her temper beginning to stir. Am I allowed to speak, or should I just stand quietly and look decorative? Jackson's mouth quirked upward in what might have been amusement. You're allowed to speak, Rebecca. In fact, I encourage it. I don't want a silent ornament for a wife, but I do expect loyalty. You don't contradict me in public, you don't embarrass me in front of my business partners, and you don't run crying to your family every time we have a disagreement. And in return, your family keeps their farm. Your father's debts are forgiven entirely, not just transferred to me. Your parents will want for nothing in their old age. His voice grew harder. But understand this. If you try to run away, if you refuse to honor this marriage, the deal is off. Your father will find himself right back where he started, minus the option of gambling his way out. The threat was delivered calmly, but Rebecca heard the steel beneath the silk. Jackson Kane was offering her a life of comfort and security in exchange for her freedom and loyalty. It was more generous than she'd expected, and more terrifying because of it. A master who treated his slaves well was still a master. What about love? She asked quietly. What about choice? What about the possibility that someday I might want to marry someone I actually care about? Jackson was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to squirm. Love is a luxury for people who can afford it, Rebecca. You can't afford it, and neither can your family. As for choice, he shrugged. You made your choice last night when you said yes. Everything after that is just details. Before Rebecca could respond, her father appeared in the doorway, nervously adjusting his collar. The preacher's here, he announced. Says he's ready whenever you folks are. Jackson stood, smoothing down his jacket with practiced ease. Then let's get married, shall we? The ceremony was mercifully brief. Reverend Matthews, clearly uncomfortable with the circumstances but unwilling to refuse Jackson Kane's request, hurried through the traditional words with the efficiency of a man eager to be elsewhere. Rebecca found herself repeating vows that felt like lies, promising to love, honor, and obey a man she barely knew. When Jackson slipped the gold band onto her finger, a ring that fit perfectly, as if he'd somehow known her size, Rebecca felt the last of her old life slip away. She was no longer Rebecca Morrison, farmer's daughter and free woman. She was Mrs. Jackson Kane, and everything that meant was still terrifyingly unclear. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and impersonal, Jackson's lips cool against hers. But Rebecca caught something in his eyes as he pulled away, a flash of something that might have been satisfaction or possession. She belonged to him now, legally and completely. As the small gathering offered stilted congratulations, Rebecca's mother pressed a small package into her hands. "Your grandmother's jewelry," she whispered. "Something to remember us by." "Mama, I'll see you again," Rebecca protested, but her mother's sad smile suggested otherwise. "Of course you will, dear. But you'll be different then. You'll be his." Jackson's hand settled on Rebecca's elbow with gentle but unmistakable authority. "We should go," he said. "I want to reach the ranch before dark." As Rebecca climbed into Jackson's elegant carriage, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known, she tried not to think about her mother's words. She tried not to wonder what kind of woman she would become as Jackson Kane's wife. Most of all, she tried not to acknowledge the tiny, treacherous part of her that was curious about the man who'd bought her hand in marriage and what he really wanted from her. The carriage rolled away from the Morrison farm with the finality of a closing door, carrying Rebecca toward her new life and whatever mysteries awaited her at the Kane Ranch. Behind them, her parents stood in the doorway, watching their daughter disappear into an uncertain future. And Rebecca wondered if she would ever see them again as the woman she used to be. But as she glanced sideways at her new husband's profile, stern and unreadable in the morning light, she realized that the woman she used to be was already gone. In her place sat Mrs. Jackson Kane, and whoever that woman turned out to be would depend entirely on the man beside her and the choices they made together. The first choice, apparently, was his to make, and Rebecca could only hope she would survive whatever he decided. The Kane Ranch spread across the horizon like a small kingdom, all rolling green pastures, white fenced corrals, and buildings that spoke of serious money. The main house rose from the prairie like something out of a fairy tale. 3 stories of limestone and timber, with wraparound porches and enough windows to light a small town. Rebecca had heard people talk about Jackson Kane's wealth, but seeing it firsthand left her speechless. "Impressive, isn't it?" Jackson said, noticing her stunned expression. "My father built the original cabin on this site 30 years ago. I've been expanding on his vision." That was an understatement of magnificent proportions. The house before them was easily 10 times the size of the Morrison farm, and from what Rebecca could see, it was only the centerpiece of an operation that employed dozens of people. Cowboys moved cattle in distant fields, workers repaired fences and tended horses, and smoke rose from what looked like a small village of outbuildings. "How many people work for you?" Rebecca asked, trying to process the scope of what was now, technically, her home. "About 60 year-round, more during calving season and roundup." Jackson helped her down from the carriage with the automatic courtesy of a gentleman, though his touch was impersonal. "You'll meet the house staff shortly. Mrs. Henderson runs the domestic side of things. She's been with the family since before my father died. I trust you'll get along with her." The way he said it suggested that getting along with Mrs. Henderson wasn't optional. Rebecca was beginning to understand that very little in her new life would be optional. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the ramrod posture of someone accustomed to running a tight ship. Mrs. Henderson's eyes swept over Rebecca with the critical assessment of a general inspecting troops, and Rebecca had the distinct feeling she'd been found wanting. "Mrs. Henderson," Jackson said formally, "may I present my wife, Rebecca?" "Rebecca, this is Mrs. Henderson, who manages the household." "Mrs. Kane," Mrs. Henderson said with a crisp nod. Her voice was perfectly polite, but Rebecca caught the subtle emphasis on her new title, a reminder that everything about her identity had changed. "Welcome to the Kane Ranch. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, trying to match the older woman's formal tone. "The house is beautiful." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly at the compliment. "Mr. Kane has excellent taste in all things. Shall I show you to your rooms?" The tour that followed was overwhelming in its luxury. The Kane house boasted amenities that Rebecca had never even imagined. Running water on all 3 floors, gas lights in every room, a library that contained more books than the entire town of Millfield, and guest bedrooms that were larger than her family's entire house. Her own suite was on the 2nd floor, connected to Jackson's rooms by a door that was currently closed but conspicuously present. "Mr. Kane thought you might prefer your own space initially," Mrs. Henderson explained, opening the door to what would be Rebecca's bedroom. "Until you've had time to adjust to married life." The room was lovely, all pale blues and creams, with furniture that looked like it had been imported from back east. A large window overlooked the gardens, and French doors opened onto a private balcony. It was the most beautiful room Rebecca had ever seen, and it felt like a prison. "Dinner is served at 7, Mrs. Henderson continued, placing Rebecca's small satchel on the bed with obvious distaste for its humble appearance. "Mr. Kane prefers to dress for the evening meal. I've taken the liberty of having some appropriate gowns delivered from town. They should fit adequately until we can arrange for a proper dressmaker." Rebecca fingered the fabric of her wedding dress, the converted tablecloth that suddenly seemed shabby and pathetic in these elegant surroundings. "That's very kind, but I couldn't accept such expensive—" "Mrs. Kane," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently but firmly, "you are the wife of one of the most successful men in the territory. People will judge Mr. Kane by how you present yourself. Surely you don't want to embarrass him." The message was clear. Her appearance reflected on Jackson's status, and anything less than perfection would be seen as a failure on her part. Rebecca nodded reluctantly, understanding that she was already being groomed for her role as the perfect rancher's wife. After Mrs. Henderson left, Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process the magnitude of the change in her circumstances. 12 hours ago, she'd been sleeping in a tiny bedroom with water stains on the ceiling and a view of the neighbor's pig pen. Now she had a suite of rooms that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and a staff of servants ready to cater to her every need. So why did she feel like crying? A soft knock at the door interrupted her melancholy. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Henderson with more instructions about proper behavior. Instead, a young woman about Rebecca's age entered, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. She had kind eyes and the comfortable manner of someone who didn't stand on ceremony. "Hello," the girl said with a smile. "I'm Mary, one of the maids. Mrs. Henderson thought you might like some tea after your journey." "Thank you, Mary. That's very thoughtful." Rebecca gestured to the chair by the window. "Would you like to sit with me for a moment? I have to admit, this is all a bit overwhelming." Mary glanced toward the door nervously. "Oh, I couldn't, ma'am." "Mrs. Henderson wouldn't approve of me socializing with—" "With what?" "Your employer's wife?" Rebecca's voice carried a note of authority she didn't know she possessed. "I think I outrank Mrs. Henderson in this house, don't I?" Mary's eyes widened, but she sat down tentatively. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose you do." "Then sit with me and tell me about this place. What's Mr. Kane like as an employer? What should I expect?" Mary poured tea with practiced efficiency, clearly weighing how much honesty was safe. "He's fair," she said finally. "Pays well, treats the staff decently, doesn't tolerate laziness or dishonesty, but doesn't expect the impossible either. He can be demanding, but he's not cruel. And personally, what's he like when he's not conducting business?" Mary's cheeks flushed slightly. "Oh, I couldn't say, ma'am. I don't see much of Mr. Kane's private life. He keeps to himself mostly, works long hours, doesn't entertain much." She paused, then added carefully, "He's been alone for a long time. Since his father died, really. This house has been missing a woman's touch." Before Rebecca could ask what she meant by that, the sound of boots on hardwood announced Jackson's arrival. Mary immediately jumped to her feet, bobbing a quick curtsy before hurrying toward the door. "Mary," Jackson said as she passed him, "I trust Mrs. Kane has everything she needs?" "Yes, sir." "She's been very kind." After Mary left, Jackson stepped into the room, and Rebecca was struck again by how his presence seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. He'd changed out of his wedding clothes into more casual attire, but he still looked every inch the successful rancher. "I see you've met some of the staff," he observed, settling into the chair Mary had vacated. What do you think of your rooms? They're beautiful, Rebecca answered honestly. More luxurious than anything I've ever experienced. I feel a bit like an imposter, to be honest. Jackson studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. You'll grow into it. Most things worth having require some adjustment. He paused, then asked, Are you satisfied with the arrangements? Is there anything you need? The question was politely asked, but Rebecca sensed it was also a test. He was giving her the opportunity to make demands, to see if she would be reasonable or difficult. She chose her words carefully. The arrangements are very generous. I do have one question, though. Yes? What exactly do you expect from me? I understand that I'm to play the role of your wife in public, but what about privately? What do you want from this marriage beyond the appearance of respectability? Jackson was quiet for so long that Rebecca began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful. I want a partner, Rebecca, someone who can represent the Kane name with dignity, who can manage the social obligations that come with my position, who can, eventually, give me children to carry on what I've built. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. I don't need love, and I don't expect it. But I do need loyalty, intelligence, and the ability to adapt to a role that's more complex than you might imagine. And if I can't adapt, if I prove unsuitable for the role you have in mind, his smile was thin and not entirely pleasant, then you'll learn to adapt, Rebecca, because the alternative isn't acceptable for either of us. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rebecca had entered into a bargain, and she would be expected to honor all its terms, spoken and unspoken. She was beginning to understand that Jackson Kane was a man who got what he paid for, and he'd paid a considerable price for her. I should let you rest, Jackson said, rising from his chair. Dinner is at 7. Mrs. Henderson will help you select appropriate attire. He paused at the door, looking back with an expression she couldn't read. Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Kane. I hope you find it satisfactory. After he left, Rebecca walked to the window and looked out over the vast expanse of land that now technically belonged to her as much as to Jackson. She was mistress of all she surveyed, with servants and luxury and security beyond anything she'd ever dreamed of. So why did she feel like a bird in a gilded cage, beautiful and comfortable but fundamentally trapped? As the sun set over the Kane Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca prepared to begin her new life as Mrs. Jackson Kane. She had no idea what that life would ultimately cost her, but she was beginning to suspect the price would be higher than anything her father had ever owed. Rebecca's first week as Mrs. Jackson Kane passed in a blur of instruction and adjustment. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a relentless teacher, drilling her on everything from proper table settings to the social hierarchy of the county's most prominent families. Rebecca learned which families were old money versus new money, which wives set the social tone, and exactly how many cards to leave when making formal calls. Mrs. Thornfield always serves tea at precisely 4 o'clock, Mrs. Henderson explained as they reviewed the calling schedule. She expects punctuality and proper dress. Mrs. Garrett, on the other hand, is more informal but extremely particular about gossip. Never repeat anything you hear in her parlor. It was like learning the rules of a foreign country, complete with customs that seemed arbitrary and consequences that were socially devastating if misunderstood. Rebecca felt like she was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong move would embarrass Jackson and reflect poorly on the Kane name. Jackson himself remained a polite stranger. He joined her for dinner each evening, making conversation about her day and offering observations about ranch business. But he maintained a careful distance. They discussed books from his extensive library, the weather, and local politics, but never anything personal. It was as if they were business partners sharing a meal rather than husband and wife sharing a home. The breakthrough, or breakdown, depending on one's perspective, came on Thursday afternoon during what was supposed to be a simple shopping trip to town. Rebecca had accompanied Mrs. Henderson to select fabric for new curtains, a task that seemed innocent enough until they encountered Mrs. Victoria Ashford in Henderson's dry goods store. Mrs. Ashford was the banker's wife, a woman whose opinion carried considerable weight in local social circles, and she clearly had thoughts about Jackson Kane's sudden marriage. "Why, Mrs. Kane?" Mrs. Ashford exclaimed, with the kind of bright smile that usually preceded social assassination. "How lovely to see you about town. I do hope you're settling in well at the ranch." "Very well, thank you," Rebecca replied carefully, remembering Mrs. Henderson's warnings about the woman's reputation for stirring up trouble. "Such a romantic story, your courtship," Mrs. Ashford continued, her eyes glittering with malicious curiosity. "Though I must say, it all happened so quickly. One day you're a farmer's daughter, the next you're married to the most eligible bachelor in the territory. How fortunate for your family's circumstances." The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Ashford knew exactly why the marriage had taken place, and she was testing to see how the new Mrs. Kane would handle direct provocation. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward smoothly. "Mrs. Ashford, I believe you were inquiring about the silk we ordered from Denver?" But Mrs. Ashford wasn't finished. "Of course, we all understand how these arrangements work among the working classes. A man of Mr. Kane's standing needs a wife who understands her place, doesn't she? Someone grateful for the elevation in circumstances." Something snapped inside Rebecca. For a week, she'd been poked and prodded and molded into Jackson Kane's idea of the perfect wife. She'd swallowed her pride, accepted charity disguised as generosity, and allowed herself to be transformed into someone she barely recognized. But she would not stand in a public store and allow this poisonous woman to reduce her to a bought and paid-for commodity. "Mrs. Ashford," Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet store, "you seem to have quite a bit to say about my marriage and my circumstances. I'm curious, do you always discuss other people's private business so openly, or am I receiving special attention?" Mrs. Ashford's smile faltered slightly. "I merely meant, you meant to be rude and insulting while maintaining plausible deniability," Rebecca interrupted. "It's a common enough tactic among people who lack the courage for honest conversation." She stepped closer, and her voice dropped to a tone that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Let me be clear about something, Mrs. Ashford. My husband married me because he chose to, for reasons that are none of your business. If you have concerns about my suitability as Mrs. Kane, I suggest you take them up with him directly. I'm sure he'd be fascinated to hear your opinions on his judgment." The store had gone completely silent. Mrs. Henderson looked like she might faint, and the clerk behind the counter was openly staring. Mrs. Ashford's face had gone through several interesting color changes, settling on a mottled red that clashed terribly with her pink dress. "Well, I never," Mrs. Ashford sputtered. "No," Rebecca agreed pleasantly. "I don't imagine you have. Good day, Mrs. Ashford." As Rebecca walked out of the store with her head high and her spine straight, she could hear the explosion of whispers behind her. Mrs. Henderson followed in stunned silence, and it wasn't until they were in the carriage heading home that the older woman found her voice. "Mrs. Kane," she said carefully, "while I certainly understand your frustration with Mrs. Ashford's rudeness, I feel I should point out that publicly, confronting the banker's wife might not have been advisable." Rebecca felt the first stirrings of doubt. In the heat of the moment, defending herself had seemed not only reasonable, but necessary. Now, with her temper cooling, she began to wonder if she'd just made a serious mistake. "She was trying to humiliate me," Rebecca said, but even to her own ears it sounded defensive. Yes, she was. And in the world Mrs. Ashford inhabits, the proper response would have been to ignore her gracefully and change the subject. Direct confrontation is not how these things are typically handled. By the time they reached the ranch, Rebecca's confidence had completely evaporated. She'd just committed exactly the kind of social error that Jackson had warned her against, and she had no idea what the consequences might be. Would he be angry, disappointed? Would this be the excuse he needed to declare her unsuitable for the role of his wife? She didn't have long to wonder. Jackson was waiting in the front parlor when they arrived, and one look at his face told Rebecca that news of her encounter with Mrs. Ashford had already reached him. "Mrs. Henderson," he said politely, "would you excuse us, please?" After the housekeeper left, Jackson studied Rebecca with an expression she couldn't read. "I hear you had an interesting afternoon in town." "I suppose you could call it that," Rebecca replied, lifting her chin with more bravado than she felt. "Mrs. Ashford felt the need to comment on our marriage arrangements, and I felt the need to correct her misconceptions." By publicly humiliating the banker's wife. By refusing to be publicly humiliated by the banker's wife. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca braced herself for the lecture about proper behavior and social expectations. Instead, he surprised her by asking, "What exactly did she say to provoke you?" Rebecca repeated the conversation as accurately as she could remember, watching Jackson's face for any sign of his reaction. When she finished, he was still unreadable. "And your response was to threaten her with my displeasure?" I, yes, I told her to take her concerns about my suitability up with you directly." To Rebecca's amazement, Jackson's mouth quirked upward in what might have been amusement. "Clever. You managed to defend yourself while making it clear that any further attacks on you would be seen as attacks on my judgment. Victoria Ashford may be many things, but she's not stupid enough to directly challenge me over my choice of wife." "You're not angry?" Jackson's expression grew more serious. "I'm not angry that you defended yourself, Rebecca, but I am concerned about the precedent this sets. If every social slight becomes a public confrontation, you'll make enemies faster than I can counter them." "So what should I have done? Stood there and let her insult me?" "You should have smiled, agreed that our courtship was indeed romantic in its brevity, and then asked her opinion on the best dressmaker in town. You should have made her feel useful and important instead of publicly diminished." Jackson stood and walked to the window, looking out over his land. "The women in our social circle fight with smiles and invitations, Rebecca. They destroy each other with exclusion and gossip, not direct confrontation. If you want to survive in their world, you need to learn their weapons." Rebecca felt a chill settle over her. Their world. "I thought this was supposed to be my world now." Jackson turned back to her, and for the first time since their marriage, she saw something like sympathy in his eyes. "It is your world, whether you chose it or not. The question is whether you want to be a victim in it or a victor." "And if I choose to be a victor? What does that make me?" Jackson's smile was sharp as a blade. "It makes you my wife in truth, not just in name. It makes you a woman who can hold her own in any company and reflect credit on the Kane name. It makes you someone I can be proud to stand beside." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. For the first time, Jackson had offered her something beyond mere tolerance. He'd offered approval, respect, even pride. All she had to do was learn to fight battles with weapons that felt foreign and underhanded to her honest nature. "I don't know if I can be that kind of woman," Rebecca admitted quietly. Jackson stepped closer, and his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "You can be any kind of woman you choose to be, Rebecca. But choose wisely, because once you've shown the world who you are, it's very difficult to change their minds." As evening fell over the Kane Ranch, Rebecca found herself at a crossroads she hadn't expected. She could continue to be the straightforward, honest woman she'd always been, and probably find herself social ostracized within a month. Or she could learn to play the games that Jackson's world required, becoming someone sophisticated and calculating, and perhaps losing herself in the process. The choice for once was entirely hers to make. She only hoped she was wise enough to choose correctly. The consequences of Rebecca's confrontation with Mrs. Ashford became apparent the following week when the invitations stopped coming. No more tea parties, no more afternoon calls, no more requests for her opinion on charitable committees. The silence was so complete and sudden that even Mrs. Henderson, who prided herself on maintaining professional discretion, couldn't hide her concern. "Perhaps we should pay a call on Mrs. Thornfield," she suggested over breakfast. "She's influential enough that her acceptance might encourage others to reconsider their hesitation." Rebecca poked at her eggs, having lost her appetite somewhere between realizing the extent of her social isolation and wondering what Jackson really thought about his wife's spectacular failure to integrate into local society. "Do you think Mrs. Thornfield would receive us?" "That," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, "would depend on how we approach the situation." Before Rebecca could ask what that meant, Jackson entered the dining room with the morning paper and the distracted air of a man dealing with complex business problems. He'd been absent more than usual this week, riding out early and returning late. Though whether that was coincidence or deliberate avoidance, Rebecca couldn't say. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, settling into his chair and accepting coffee from the hovering servant. "I trust you slept well?" The polite fiction that everything was normal was beginning to wear on Rebecca's nerves. Well enough. Mrs. Henderson was just suggesting we pay a call on Mrs. Thornfield. Jackson's hand paused infinitesimally as he reached for the sugar bowl. Was she? And what prompted this suggestion? The fact that your wife has been socially excommunicated and you seem determined to pretend it hasn't happened? Rebecca said, her patience finally snapping. I understand that my behavior last week was inappropriate by local standards, but ignoring the consequences won't make them disappear. Jackson set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision and gave Rebecca his full attention for the first time in days. You think I've been ignoring the situation? Haven't you? You've barely spoken to me all week. You leave the house before I wake up and come home after I've retired. If you're trying to distance yourself from the embarrassment I've caused, you might simply say so. Mrs. Henderson made a small sound of distress, whether at Rebecca's directness or the tension suddenly filling the room. Jackson's expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes suggested Rebecca had just made another tactical error. Mrs. Henderson, Jackson said without taking his gaze off Rebecca, would you excuse us, please? After the housekeeper fled, Jackson leaned back in his chair and studied his wife with the intensity of a man reassessing his initial judgment. You think I've been avoiding you because I'm embarrassed by your behavior? What else am I supposed to think? You warned me about the importance of social acceptance. I spectacularly failed to achieve it, and now you can barely stand to be in the same room with me. Jackson's laugh was short and sharp. Rebecca, if I were embarrassed by your behavior, we'd be having a very different conversation. No, my absence this week has had nothing to do with disappointment and everything to do with damage control. Damage control? Jackson stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose Rebecca was beginning to recognize as his thinking position. Do you know who Victoria Ashford's husband is, besides being the local banker? No. He's also the territorial representative for the Cattlemen's Association, which means he has considerable influence over grazing rights, water access, and railroad shipping contracts. His opinion can make or break ranchers throughout this region. Jackson turned back to her, his expression grim. When you publicly humiliated his wife, you didn't just commit a social error. You potentially threatened the economic foundation of everything I've built. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't. How could you? You've been thrust into a world you don't understand, with rules no one bothered to fully explain. Jackson's voice was matter-of-fact, but Rebecca caught an undertone of something that might have been sympathy. Which is why I've spent the week visiting every major rancher in the territory, making sure they understand that my wife's spirited defense of her position reflects her loyalty to our marriage rather than any disrespect toward the community. And most of them found it rather refreshing, actually. Victoria Ashford has made enemies over the years with her sharp tongue and social manipulation. Several people were secretly pleased to see her receive a taste of her own medicine. Jackson's smile was thin but genuine. The trick now is to manage the narrative before it gets out of control. Rebecca felt a rush of relief, followed immediately by guilt. I'm sorry. I should have thought before I acted. I should have considered the implications. Yes, you should have. But what's done is done. Jackson returned to his seat, his manner becoming more businesslike. The question now is how we proceed. You have two choices, Rebecca. You can retreat into social exile, which will eventually make my business relationships more difficult but won't destroy them. Or you can learn to fight more strategically. What do you mean? Jackson's smile turned predatory. I mean, we're going to throw a party. A grand social event that will force everyone who matters to choose between accepting you as my wife or openly snubbing the most powerful family in the territory. And you're going to be so charming, so gracious, and so clearly deserving of respect that anyone who continues to ostracize you will look petty and small. The scope of what he was suggesting took Rebecca's breath away. You want me to host a party for people who've spent the week pretending I don't exist? I want you to host a party for people who need to be reminded exactly who you are and what crossing you means. Jackson leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. But it has to be perfect, Rebecca. Every detail, every interaction, Every moment has to demonstrate that you're not just the wife of Jackson Kane. You're a woman worthy of that position in your own right. Rebecca felt panic rising in her throat. The thought of organizing a social event for the same people who'd been snubbing her was terrifying enough. But doing it under Jackson's critical eye, with the success of his business relationships potentially hanging in the balance, felt impossible. I don't know how, she admitted quietly. I don't know the first thing about hosting grand parties or managing the kind of social politics you're talking about. Then you'll learn. Jackson's voice was implacable. Mrs. Henderson will help with the practical arrangements, and I'll provide guidance on the guest list and strategic considerations. But the success or failure of this event will rest entirely on your shoulders. And if I fail? Jackson was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. If you fail, Rebecca, it won't just be a social embarrassment. It will be a statement about your place in this community and our marriage. People will decide that you're not worthy of the Kane name, and that judgment will follow us both for years to come. The weight of responsibility settled on Rebecca's shoulders like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about redemption or social acceptance anymore. It was about proving herself worthy of the life Jackson had given her, worthy of the respect he was trying to secure for her. When would this party take place? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 weeks from today. That gives us enough time to plan properly and send invitations, but not so much time that people forget why we're having it. Jackson stood, effectively ending the conversation. I'll have Mrs. Henderson begin the preliminary arrangements this afternoon. As he moved toward the door, Rebecca called after him. Jackson? He paused, looking back expectantly. Why are you doing this? Why not just accept that I've made myself socially unacceptable and move on? Jackson's expression was unreadable. Because you're my wife, Rebecca. That means your success is my success and your failure is my failure. I don't accept failure. After he left, Rebecca sat alone in the dining room, staring out at the vast expanse of land that stretched to the horizon. In 3 weeks, she would either establish herself as a force to be reckoned with in local society, or she would confirm everyone's worst assumptions about her unsuitability for her elevated position. The thought was terrifying, but it was also oddly liberating. For the first time since her forced marriage, she had a clear goal and a definitive test of her worth. She might not have chosen this life, but she was determined to excel at it. Victoria Ashford and her allies had no idea what was coming their way. Rebecca was about to show them exactly what the new Mrs. Kane was capable of when she put her mind to it. The game was about to begin in earnest, and this time Rebecca intended to win. The Kane Ranch transformed over the following 2 weeks into something resembling a military operation preparing for siege. Servants cleaned and polished every surface until the house gleamed, while Rebecca found herself immersed in a crash course in haute cuisine, floral arrangements, and the delicate art of orchestrating conversations among people who alternately despised or envied each other. Mrs. Henderson proved invaluable, her decades of experience serving the territory's elite, providing insights that no etiquette book could offer. Mrs. Garrett must never be seated near Mrs. Coleman, she explained as they worked on the seating chart. They've been feuding since Mrs. Coleman accused Mrs. Garrett of stealing her prized rose cuttings 3 years ago. And Mrs. Thornfield? Mrs. Thornfield should be seated at your right hand, as befits her position as the unofficial social leader. But you'll want to place someone charming and harmless near her, perhaps young Mrs. Walsh, who's too new to have made enemies yet. Rebecca's head spun with the complexity of managing personalities, egos, and decades-old grudges. It was like planning a dinner party in a minefield, where one wrong step could explode into social warfare that would last for generations. Jackson, meanwhile, had taken charge of the male guest list with the strategic precision of a general planning a campaign. The key, he explained over dinner one evening, is to make sure every influential man in the territory feels obligated to attend. If their wives come alone, it looks like they're here to gossip about you. If the men come too, it's a legitimate social event. And how do you obligate powerful men to attend a party they might prefer to avoid? Jackson's smile was sharp. By making sure they understand that absence would be noted and remembered. Business relationships in the territory are complex, Rebecca. Every rancher depends on cooperation with his neighbors for everything from shared grazing rights to protection against rustlers. No one wants to risk isolation over a social slight. The guest list, when finally completed, read like a who's who of territorial power. Bankers, judges, large ranchers, territorial legislators, and their wives, all of whom would be coming to examine Jackson Kane's controversial bride and decide whether she was worthy of acceptance or deserved continued ostracism. The menu alone was enough to make Rebecca's head spin. Mrs. Henderson had consulted with the finest hotel in Denver to ensure that every dish would demonstrate both sophistication and abundance. There would be oysters shipped in ice from San Francisco, beef from their own prize cattle, vegetables from the ranch's greenhouse, and desserts that required ingredients Rebecca had never heard of. The goal, Mrs. Henderson explained as they reviewed the final preparations, is to make it clear that this household operates at a level far above anything else in the territory. Every detail should reinforce that you are not just Mrs. Kane in name, but Mrs. Kane in fact, deserving of the respect that position commands. 3 days before the party, Rebecca's courage finally wavered. She stood in her bedroom surrounded by fabric samples and invitation responses and felt the magnitude of what she was attempting crash over her like a wave. In 72 hours, she would be hosting the most important social event the territory had seen in years, and the success or failure of the evening would determine not just her own future, but potentially Jackson's business relationships as well. "I can't do this," she whispered to her reflection in the mirror. "I'm going to humiliate us both." Having second thoughts, Rebecca spun around to find Jackson standing in the doorway, connecting their rooms. She hadn't heard him enter, and the realization that he'd witnessed her moment of panic made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I seat someone inappropriately? What if the food is wrong or the entertainment is boring or—" "Rebecca." Jackson's voice cut through her spiraling anxiety. "Come here." She approached him warily, unsure what to expect. When she was close enough, he reached out and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked quietly. Rebecca shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who stood up to a professional gambler to protect her dignity. I see someone who defended herself against Victoria Ashford's calculated cruelty without backing down. I see a farmer's daughter who learned to read financial ledgers and manage household accounts because her family needed her to be capable." His thumb brushed across her cheek with unexpected gentleness. "I see strength, intelligence, and courage. The question is whether you see those things in yourself." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. Since their marriage, Jackson had been unfailingly polite but distant, treating her more like a business partner than a wife. This moment of genuine connection caught her completely off guard. "I'm not the kind of woman who belongs in this world," she whispered. "You're exactly the kind of woman who belongs in this world, because you're the kind of woman who can change it." Jackson's hands settled on her shoulders, steadying her. "Those people coming to our party, they're not special because they were born to wealth or status. They're only powerful because they've convinced everyone else to treat them as if they were. But power based on consensus can shift, Rebecca. It can be claimed by someone strong enough to take it. Is that what you want me to do? Take power?" Jackson's smile was small, but genuine. "I want you to claim your rightful place as my wife. Everything else will follow naturally." The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, nothing like the perfunctory peck that had sealed their wedding vows. When Jackson pulled away, Rebecca felt something shift between them. Not love, perhaps, but understanding, and the beginning of genuine partnership. "The evening will be perfect," Jackson said with quiet confidence, "because you'll make it perfect. And afterward, no one in this territory will ever question whether you deserve to be Mrs. Jackson Kane." As the final preparations continued over the next 3 days, Rebecca found herself drawing strength from that conversation. Jackson believed in her capability, even if he couldn't offer her love. More importantly, she was beginning to believe in herself. The evening of the party dawned clear and cool, with stars already visible in the darkening sky as the first carriages began arriving. Rebecca stood in the front parlor, wearing a dress of deep blue silk that had been specially ordered from Denver. her hair arranged in an elaborate style that Mrs. Henderson had practiced for days. She looked like a woman worthy of the Kane name, and for the first time since her marriage, she felt like one too. As Jackson appeared at her side, resplendent in evening dress, and offered her his arm, Rebecca realized that this evening would determine more than her social standing. It would determine what kind of marriage she and Jackson would have, what kind of woman she would become, and what kind of future they would build together. The sound of voices and laughter began to fill the house as their guests arrived, and Rebecca straightened her shoulders with new resolve. She had been thrust into this role against her will, but she would excel at it by choice. The game was about to begin, and Mrs. Jackson Kane was ready to play for keeps. The evening that would later be remembered as the most successful social event in territorial history began with Victoria Ashford's deliberately late arrival. She swept into the Kane house 45 minutes after the stated time, clearly intending to make an entrance that would undermine Rebecca's confidence and establish her own social dominance. Instead, she found herself walking into a gathering that was already humming with animated conversation, elegant laughter, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a supremely successful party. Rebecca stood near the fireplace, surrounded by a small circle of influential wives who were hanging on her every word as she described the renovation plans for the ranch's guest house. "Mrs. Ashford," Rebecca called out warmly, excusing herself from her admirers and gliding across the room with the grace of a woman born to elegant drawing rooms. "How wonderful that you could join us. I was just telling Mrs. Thornfield about your reputation for exquisite taste in interior decoration. I do hope you'll share your thoughts on the Chinese silk we're considering for the East Parlor." It was a masterful maneuver that Rebecca had practiced with Mrs. Henderson for hours. By publicly praising Victoria's expertise and asking for her opinion, Rebecca had made it socially impossible for the other woman to be anything but gracious in return. Victoria had two choices: accept the compliment and engage pleasantly, or reveal herself as petty and small-minded in front of the territory's most influential people. "How thoughtful of you to ask," Victoria replied, her smile so tight it looked painful. "I'd be delighted to offer any assistance." "Excellent. Mrs. Henderson has samples laid out in the morning room if you'd care to examine them later." Rebecca turned to include the other women in the conversation. "Mrs. Ashford has such an eye for color coordination. I'm sure she'll provide exactly the guidance we need." As the evening progressed, Rebecca deployed similar tactics with surgical precision. She praised Mrs. Coleman's famous rose garden and asked for advice on expanding the ranch's flower beds. She complimented Mrs. Garrett's daughter's recent engagement and sought her wisdom on wedding planning for the young couples in their social circle. She treated each potential enemy as if they were valued advisors, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain their hostile stance. The men's side of the gathering was proceeding equally well, thanks to Jackson's careful orchestration. Rebecca caught glimpses of animated discussions about cattle prices, railroad development, and territorial politics, all taking place in an atmosphere of convivial cooperation that would have been impossible if the social dynamics had been hostile. The dinner itself was a triumph of logistics and diplomacy. Every dish was perfectly prepared, every wine selection enhanced the conversation, and every seating arrangement proved strategically inspired. Mrs. Thornfield found herself charmed by young Mrs. Walsh's innocent questions about territorial history. Judge Morrison discovered that Rebecca had an impressive grasp of legal precedents affecting land rights. Even the territorial representative seemed genuinely impressed by the quality of the Kane hospitality, but it was during the after-dinner entertainment that Rebecca achieved her masterstroke. Instead of the typical musical performance or poetry reading, she had arranged for a presentation by Professor Williams from the Denver Agricultural College, who spoke about new farming techniques that could increase crop yields throughout the territory. The scientific approach to soil management, the professor explained, using charts and diagrams that Jackson had commissioned specifically for the evening, can increase productivity by as much as 30% while reducing the environmental impact of traditional farming methods. The presentation was brilliant for several reasons. It demonstrated the Kane Ranch's commitment to progress and innovation. It provided valuable information that would benefit every rancher in attendance. And it positioned Rebecca as someone who thought beyond social pleasantries to substantive issues affecting their community's future. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, Rebecca found herself standing with Jackson in the front hall, accepting compliments and thanks from departing guests. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Where she'd begun the evening as Jackson Kane's questionable wife, she was ending it as a respected hostess who had clearly earned her position. "Mrs. Kane," Judge Morrison said as he prepared to leave, "this has been an exceptional evening. I hope we can look forward to more such gatherings in the future." "Thank you, Judge Morrison. Jackson and I certainly hope to make this an annual tradition." Mrs. Thornfield was equally effusive in her praise. "My dear, you've set a standard that will be difficult for the rest of us to match." The professor's presentation was particularly enlightening. Even Victoria Ashford managed a grudging compliment as she waited for her carriage. "A lovely evening, Mrs. Kane. Very educational." After the last guest had departed and the servants had begun clearing away the remnants of the party, Rebecca finally allowed herself to collapse into a chair in the front parlor. Her feet ached from standing, her cheeks hurt from smiling, and her head buzzed with the effort of managing conversations, personalities, and social dynamics for 5 straight hours. "How do you think it went?" she asked Jackson, who was pouring himself a brandy from the crystal decanter on the side table. Jackson's smile was the warmest she'd ever seen from him. "I think you just established yourself as the most formidable hostess in the territory. I also think several very powerful people spent the evening revising their opinions about the new Mrs. Kane. And your business relationships? Secure. More than secure, actually. Judge Morrison mentioned that he'd like to discuss some property development opportunities with me, and the territorial representative practically offered to support any legislation I might want to propose." Jackson settled into the chair across from her, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Congratulations, Rebecca. You've achieved something remarkable tonight." Rebecca felt a flush of pride and satisfaction, unlike anything she'd experienced before. For the first time since her forced marriage, she felt like she'd accomplished something entirely on her own merit. She'd taken a nearly impossible situation and turned it into a triumph through skill, intelligence, and determination. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance," she said honestly, "or Mrs. Henderson's expertise." "The guidance and expertise were tools, Rebecca. But the woman who wielded them tonight, that was all you." Jackson's expression grew more serious. "I want you to know that what you accomplished this evening goes far beyond social success. You've proven that you can adapt to any situation, master any challenge, and emerge victorious against overwhelming odds. Those are rare qualities in anyone, man or woman." Something in his tone made Rebecca look at him more closely. "It sounds like you're surprised." "Not surprised exactly, but impressed in ways I didn't expect to be." Jackson set down his brandy and leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "When I offered to pay your father's debt in exchange for marriage, I thought I was acquiring a competent wife who could fulfill the social obligations of my position. What I discovered tonight is that I may have acquired something far more valuable, a true partner." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to explore. They weren't declarations of love, but they were something perhaps more solid. Expressions of respect, partnership, and the recognition that their marriage might become something genuine rather than merely convenient. "Does this mean I've passed your test?" Rebecca asked quietly. Jackson's smile was soft and genuine. "Rebecca, you didn't just pass the test. You exceeded every expectation I had. The question now is what we do with this partnership we've discovered." As they sat together in the quiet aftermath of their social triumph, Rebecca realized that her marriage to Jackson Kane had transformed once again. She was no longer the desperate farmer's daughter who'd been bartered to pay her father's debts. She wasn't just the trophy wife of a powerful rancher. She had become something new, a woman of influence and capability in her own right, worthy of respect and partnership. The forced marriage that had begun with coercion and desperation had evolved into something that might, with time and effort, become the foundation for a genuinely fulfilling life. Not the life she'd chosen, perhaps, but a life she was increasingly proud to claim as her own. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered across the prairie with the sound of new beginnings, and inside the Kane house, Two people who had married as strangers began to recognize the possibility of becoming something more. Partners, allies, and perhaps, eventually, something approaching love. The game was over, and Rebecca had won more completely than she'd ever dared to hope. Now the real work of building a marriage and a life together could truly begin. 5 years later, Rebecca Kane stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching her husband and their 3-year-old son work together to mend a section of fence. Little Thomas had Jackson's determined expression and Rebecca's stubborn streak, a combination that promised interesting times ahead. In her arms, baby Catherine dozed contentedly, oblivious to the late afternoon bustle of one of the territory's most successful ranches. The transformation that had begun with a desperate gamble in a grimy saloon had grown into something none of them could have imagined. The Kane Ranch now employed over 100 workers, owned the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, and had spawned subsidiary businesses in banking, railroad development, and agricultural innovation. Rebecca's social triumph had opened doors that led to business opportunities, political influence, and the kind of prosperity that made their original problems seem like distant memories. But it wasn't the wealth or status that satisfied Rebecca most as she watched her family in the golden light of evening. It was the knowledge that she had earned every bit of it through her own strength, intelligence, and determination. The desperate girl who had been traded to pay her father's gambling debts had become a woman of substance, respected throughout the territory for her business acumen as much as her social skills. "Mama, look!" Thomas called out, his voice bright with pride as he successfully hammered a nail into the fence post. "I fixed it." "Excellent work, sweetheart," Rebecca called back, smiling at Jackson's patient coaching of their headstrong son. The man who had once seemed so intimidating and distant had revealed himself to be a devoted father and eventually a loving husband. Their marriage, born of necessity and nurtured by mutual respect, had slowly grown into something neither of them had expected but both treasured. Mrs. Henderson approached from the house carrying a tea service and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman whose careful guidance had helped create a social success story. "The Ladies' Auxiliary Committee is meeting next week to discuss the new school funding proposal," she reported. "They're hoping you'll agree to chair the committee." Rebecca nodded, already mentally organizing the political maneuvering that would be required to secure territorial funding for education improvements. It was exactly the kind of challenge she'd learned to relish: complex, important, and requiring the same combination of social skill and strategic thinking that had made her evening party such a triumph. "Of course I'll chair the committee," she said. "Education is far too important to leave to politicians who've never set foot in a frontier classroom." As the sun set over the vast expanse of land that stretched to the horizon, Rebecca reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd had no choice but to marry Jackson Kane, but every choice since then had been hers to make. She'd chosen to excel rather than merely survive, to build rather than simply endure, to claim power rather than accept powerlessness. The woman who had once been told that nobody wanted a farmer's daughter had become someone whose opinion was sought by judges and legislators, whose social events set the standard for the entire territory, whose business partnerships were as valuable as any man's. She'd discovered that worth wasn't determined by circumstances of birth, but by what you chose to do with whatever opportunities life presented. Jackson approached the porch as Thomas ran off to play with the ranch dogs, his face showing the contentment of a man who'd found more than he'd ever thought to seek. "Good day?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch swing they'd installed the previous spring. "Very good," Rebecca replied, shifting Catherine to make room for Jackson's arm around her shoulders. "Mrs. Henderson says the Ladies' Auxiliary wants me to chair the Education Committee." "And you said yes, of course." "Of course. Someone needs to make sure those children get the resources they deserve." Rebecca leaned into her husband's warmth, marveling again at how natural this felt, this partnership they'd built from the ruins of coercion and desperation. "I have some news too," Jackson said. "The territorial governor wants to discuss having me run for the legislature next year. Apparently, my wife's reputation for getting things done has enhanced my own political prospects considerably." Rebecca laughed, remembering the shy, desperate girl who'd been too frightened to speak up for herself in her father's presence. Who would have thought that buying a reluctant bride would turn out to be such a wise political investment? The wisest investment I ever made, Jackson agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Though I'm not sure bought is the right word anymore. No, Rebecca said thoughtfully, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while Catherine stirred sleepily in her arms. I think earned is more accurate. We earned each other, earned this life, earned the right to call ourselves a family. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their prosperous ranch, Rebecca Kane reflected on the truth she'd learned through trial and fire. Nobody had wanted a desperate farmer's daughter, but the world had been waiting for a woman strong enough to claim her own destiny. The only question had been whether she would be brave enough to become that woman. Looking at her husband, her children, and the empire they'd built together, Rebecca knew she'd found her answer. She'd been brave enough, strong enough, and smart enough to transform a forced marriage into a chosen partnership and a desperate situation into a triumphant life. The story that had begun with the words, "I'll pay your father's debt, but you're my wife now," had become something far greater, a testament to the power of choice, the strength of determination, and the truth that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings could lead to the most satisfying endings. Nobody had wanted a fat girl. Nobody had wanted a desperate farmer's daughter. Nobody had wanted a woman who refused to know her place. But Jackson Kane had been wise enough to recognize a treasure disguised as a burden, and Rebecca had been strong enough to prove that his investment in her was the best decision he'd ever made. The forced marriage had become a chosen partnership. The desperate bargain had become a love story, and the girl who'd had no choice had become a woman who created choices for everyone around her. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from getting what you wanted, but from making what you got into something better than you'd ever dared to dream. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you believe strength isn't about size but about spirit, and love isn't about perfection but about partnership, then don't just ride off into the sunset. Stay a while. Tell us in the comments what moment made you believe in Rebecca's strength or Jackson's hidden heart. And if you're drawn to stories where desperate beginnings become triumphant endings, where the Wild West tested hearts as much as courage, hit that subscribe button. Join Wild West Stories and ride with us every week, where bullets missed but destinies didn't.